Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Professor Leon Blevins, Professor of Government at El Paso Community College. I want to tell just a little brief story. As you know, I do tell stories sometimes before I introduce my guest. For a number of years, I lived in El Paso during the summer taking some graduate courses. Left for 2 years and taught in other states. Came back, finished a master's degree at UTEP. They changed the name of the school in 1967 when I got a master's. Then I left for 5 years teaching in other places, and when I came back, I kept hearing things about the mountain, Mount Franklin. Well, I knew Mount Franklin was there. When I was in Lubbock, I would see some of the people who lived in El Paso before, and I'd say, what do you miss most about El Paso? And they say, the rock fences and the mountains. I heard that a lot, rock fences and the mountains. That's El Paso's notation for. And so then I kept hearing about the mountain. There was a man named Dick Knapp that was buying up a lot of land on the east side of the mountain for developing up the mountain. And then I heard about and discussed these in class and heard about zoning and rezoning and fights before city council, and then a movement to purchase the land and develop a state park. So now we have Mount Franklin State Park. They will not let them build up beyond a certain level at the park. So with that story, I have today with me Janaé Field. Is that right?
Janaé.
Janaé Field. Oh, that's French. Very romantic. Janaé Field. You have a middle name. What was your original name?
Renauld is my maiden name.
I love this. I wish I could say it better. Please forgive me. And Scott Cutler?
Correct.
Oh, that's easy to say. Nothing French about that, right?
Not at all. No.
And these two people are very involved with the Frontera Land Alliance in conserving the mountain and open space so that the future, our children and grandchildren and others, will be able to enjoy what we have enjoyed instead of it being covered up with urban sprawl. Which of the two of you want to deal with this first? How did you get into this? Which of you got into this first?
Well, I probably was here early on.
Do you remember the Dick Knapp episodes?
Well, that actually happened a little after I came, although when I first came to El Paso in '71 to visit, I went hiking up in the mountains and actually camped, or was going to spend the night up where the road is, Mundy Gap, where Dick Knapp ended up putting his road through. But I've since then moved to El Paso in the late 80s and have been here since '93 and have been involved with a lot of other issues post-formation of the state park that would relate to the conservation, further conservation. As you mentioned, the Dick Knapp's efforts to build on the mountain sort of spurred this conservation effort to get the mountains set aside as a state park. And as part of that process, they wanted to include Kastner Range, which is 7,000 acres of land just to the east of the state park, a little north of Hondo Pass and south of...
That's close to our Trans Mountain campus.
That's correct. But in trying to negotiate the whole deal, because there were still unexploded ordinances on the Kastner Range property, the state park was unwilling to take it at that time. But in the legislation that caused the formation of the state park, they left a provision in there saying that if and when that property becomes cleared, it can be transferred to the state park.
And they've been slowly clearing.
Well, very slowly. Right, there's still a lot that has not been cleared and has not been explored fully to see what is there, although that is taking place right now. But as you can see in the picture here, there's a whole lot of land that is right near Interstate 50 or Highway 54 that is very attractive for developing either commercial or residential. And so there have always been these efforts to try and get pieces of it cleared and then build on it. And groups like the Franklin Mountains Wilderness Coalition and then more recently the Frontera Land Alliance formed to try and find a way to be able to preserve that land.
When was it formed? When did this organization
start? The Frontera Land Alliance became officially formed in 2005. That's when we were incorporated.
Well, that's fairly recent.
Yes. And it's the main purpose for it being formed initially was to try and preserve Kastner Range, to provide an avenue whereby once the land was cleared, something like a conservation easement could be considered for it, and then it could be transferred to a land trust. The easement could be transferred to a land trust, which would hold that easement, and that easement would state that the land could never be built on.
That's good.
So it would be preserved as open space.
Okay.
So Frontera's been working on that since our formation, along with some other properties as well, trying to preserve as much open space within the area of West Texas as we can, primarily El Paso County and Hudspeth County, but we also would be looking into southern New Mexico, like Doña Ana County. And
at some point you have to focus your attention, though. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we've got limited resources, so certainly our major efforts have been around the El Paso area right now, trying to preserve what open space is still there.
Now let's find out how Janaé got into this and when.
I started working for the Frontera Land Alliance August of 2011 when I moved to El Paso that spring.
Okay.
Prior to that, I was in Central Texas, the executive director of a land trust there. And prior to that, I was in Michigan working for a land trust, went to school there, was in the Peace Corps, and just over the years just worked my way and ended up in Texas. And then I moved to El Paso. And I got a job with the Frontera Land Alliance.
All right. Now, how many paid employees do you have with this?
We have one. It's Janaé.
That's me.
You're it.
I'm it.
Well, there's a lot on your shoulders then.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Do you want to give us a telephone number or website so people can check you out? I went to the internet and simply typed in Frontera Land Alliance, and I ran it out of the printer there. And it told me a little bit about your organization. You want to give a telephone number and a website, maybe?
Sure. The website is www.fronteralandalliance.org, and the office phone number is 915-351-8352.
Okay, they're going to put that across the screen there, just as you've given that to us. Now, you're looking at this mountain here. We're looking which direction? We're looking
west.
West,
So this
okay.
is North Mount Franklin. This is South Franklin Peak, where all of the towers are. And then this is Trans Mountain Road that comes through here, comes down here to the, oh no, I'm sorry. Trans Mountain Road is over here.
Okay.
And there's the Archaeology Museum. This is Hondo Pass down here. So this is Fusselman Canyon up in here.
Maybe a couple of years ago, I did an interview on this program with a gentleman from Ranger Peak and Waco Tanks. Because of the budget problems with the state, they cut back on the number of people that were being paid by the state and moved the director from Ranger Peak, I believe, under Waco Tanks. Is that right? And some of these things. Now, Janaé, a question to you about what's the difference of working on land trust here, say, to Michigan and Central Texas? Are there any differences?
There are, in the sense of the mindset of the local residents. Then this far west in Texas, the development that's encroaching is all around the mountain or along the Rio Grande in El Paso County. And there's a lot of open space beyond that. So it may not have the residents as concerned about the desert disappearing or the actual surface of the property changing. In the hill country around Austin and San Antonio and the other towns, I worked from Guadalupe River watershed down to the coast. And there's a ton of growth. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of people looking for those summer country homes or ranches to just play with and get into that field, but not necessarily use it as a profession. And then in Ann Arbor, where I was at that land trust, it was around the University of Michigan, and it was just exploding with people moving there and development. So there's a lot more development pressure there as well. So the development pressure here isn't in the same way that it is in the other areas.
I can understand that.
And so there's not as much concern, I don't think, about conservation out in the desert. Around the mountain, there is a lot of concern about it changing the landscapes as you drive down I-10 and up 54, that you might see development encroaching up the sides of the mountain if the private property is sold and developed. And then people forget that the desert, as people expand out and out, that it too will disappear if not conserved.
And that affects so many things. You're talking about animal life. You're talking about water recharge from rain and runoff and things like that. that many people don't even think about. They just turn on their faucets and think, here it is. What about this? How do you convince people to want to conserve the land?
Well, I think part of it is providing people with examples of where the pressure has reached a point that the locals have decided that they have to find some way to conserve their water resources. And Janaé mentioned the hill country in central Texas. It's a good example, I think, of where people recognize that the aquifer that they depend on for their water, for all of the development that's going on, is really in jeopardy if the open space that has always allowed the rainwater to recharge those aquifers is built on. Because when you do that, you're essentially forming an impermeable barrier that causes all the water to run away rather than soak into the ground and recharge the aquifer. We have the same thing here, where we're relying for a large part on the Waco Bolson and the Mesilla Bolson as a water source for us. And as we build up and pave over more of the landscape, then the water that traditionally would have recharged in those bolsons is diverted off into stormwater canals and down to the river and goes away from our area. So our water resources are put in under more stress because of that.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking back to the 1950s, late 40s and 50s. After World War II, my father stayed in California. My mother stayed here in Texas. My father remarried, and I would go out there some, and there were sometimes issues about going to the beach because some of the rich people were buying the beach land, and so there were fights over access trails or something to get to the beaches. And then I remember I had an uncle in Garden Grove, California, that owned a bakery. One time I was helping deliver pastries and bakery things around Fullerton and Anaheim, and some man said, "Charlie," my uncle, "did you know that Walt Disney's buying up a bunch of this land? He's buying all this land, these not olive groves, lemon groves and orange groves, and flower groves, and going to build a theme park, going to build he said, amusement park." And if Charlie had bought some of that land around there, he'd have been rich by now. Okay. Now, what about that? Did you run into any of this in El Paso, access and corridors or anything?
In the sense like of the loss of?
Of trying to get to land that is being. I remember our governor, Perry, at one time talked about the Trans-Texas Corridor, a big pipeline, highway system, electronic traffic and everything. And some of the ranchers were saying, no, you're not going to mess with my land.
Well, I see an issue with the corridors and access to public land. For instance, taking in the state park here, wherever, well, if you were to see an aerial view of the mountain looking down on it, you would see the urban development going around. And so the park is becoming landlocked with private development. And unless there are these wildlife corridors or the arroyos that come off the mountain and essentially go down to the river, if those aren't protected in some way, then eventually all access to the mountain, the state park essentially in the mountain, will be unaccessible because it'll be built up with private property around it. So part of what Frontera wants to do is protect the arroyos, get conservation easements put on those in some way that protects them so that there's not just a wildlife corridor, but it also provides person access, human access to the park.
A few years ago, we kept hearing on the news about an arroyo on the west side. I live on the east side, close to Eastwood High School. And on the west side, about an arroyo there that neighbors along the top of the arroyo, and I've always taught this, if you come along and you change some arroyos, you're changing a lot of things. If you build down in there, you chance of getting flooded, of course. But you're changing other things, wildlife, foliage, and so on. Was your group involved in the arroyo over there and getting homeowners to sign up to try to protect it?
Well, there were a couple of arroyos that the Frontera was involved in. The Wrestler Arroyo, which is now called the Joaquin Teschner Nature Preserve, was one that in 2005 was slated to be developed. The landowner was planning to put in something like 130 homes in the bottom of this arroyo. And,
that's crazy.
Well, he had plans that were supposed to make it work, but all of the residents around there were very protective of it because they'd grown to love this arroyo. And so they started a big effort to try and get it protected, and it eventually turned out that one of the neighbors of that arroyo had inherited some money and decided he was going to use that money to buy the arroyo from the developer.
Wow.
And when he did that, Frontera was just newly formed at that time, and so he decided to give the money to Frontera to purchase the arroyo. And so we now have the Joaquin Teschner Nature Preserve at Ressler Arroyo that we own and manage as a nature preserve. It's open for the public to come into as well. And a second example is with a place called Thunder Canyon. It was about a 24 acre.
Now, you've told me before the show that you have pictures available that we can weave into the program so the public can see that.
Correct, yeah,
Okay,
we will provide those. But Thunder Canyon was another place where the development had occurred around the ridges of the canyon, but the bottom of it was privately owned by a developer who had planned to put in a development. Well, again, the people up on the top had gotten used to this arroyo, and it was really a beautiful one, and they didn't want it built up. They didn't want homes down in the bottom.
Right.
So they talked with the developer who was willing to work out a deal with them, but they didn't have the money to buy it outright. So they ended up talking to the city, and the city was willing to front the money if the residents would then tax themselves to repay the city the amount that they put out, that the city put out. And so they now, the residents around that arroyo now pay the city every month as part of their property taxes, an amount that will eventually repay that. But in the process, to make sure that the future homeowners of the land would not have it developed in some way, decide that they wanted to sell it off for some reason, the homeowners and the city put a conservation easement on it that prevents any development from occurring in there, and Frontera holds that easement. So this was a really nice partnership between Frontera, the homeowners, and the city to create this public improvement district, which has now preserved Thunder Canyon forever.
Another story comes to mind with regard to the big flood of 2006. You do remember our flood?
I do.
I was watching the news one night, and a friend of mine named Leona Washington, a well-known, well-respected teacher, African-American woman, and I'd worked on some projects with her, and she was on the news, and her house had been flooded on Missouri and had like 2 or 3 feet of mud in it. So I told my wife, I'm going to go see Leona tomorrow, and I'm going to take her some cash, and I can't do some of the labor work, but I can give her some money to help hire somebody to help clean out her house. So I go down there the next day, and she tells me, Blevins, I've lived here for years and years and years and years. And it used to be when the rainwater came, it just went to the Rio Grande. They built the interstate, and they blocked it all off. The water comes out of the mountain now, and it floods us all along Wyoming and Missouri and these areas. And then, of course, they put a dip in there on the interstate, and it locked us all down for a while. A lot of times, the people that are designing and planning, both politicians and engineers, are not thinking about those kind of things.
I think probably 2006 was a wake-up call for a lot of them, so that in all the future planning, they're more cognizant of that. But you're right. Any of the development that's in there, these arroyos, is certainly more likely to have problems in the future, especially if the human-engineered stormwater system plugs up or fails in some way. Then it can create havoc with any of the development that goes in there. So leaving a lot of these arroyos as natural open space is a very simple solution. It doesn't cost the public any money to maintain them. Right. So for ever and ever, essentially, you've got a nice conduit to take rainwater away from the mountain and any development that may occur up on the tops of them.
I like to ask questions about in relationships with other groups too. Years ago, I joined Concordia Heritage Association, some of the people that Bernie and Melissa Sargent, and then another organization that I've been with, Carol Miller, a member of that, an English teacher at UTEP. And some of these people gathered together, it's on the west side, and they saw a situation where a big businessman was fixing to turn the Keystone area into parking lots and warehouses. And so I helped them on some fundraising on some of those along with other people. I couldn't get real involved because I'm so far across town. I couldn't meet with them a lot of times. But they helped save that area we now would call Keystone Park, a water fly-through and an archaeological site going way back there. When the people were working on the interstate, they uncovered these native remains. What about in Central Texas or Michigan? Did you ever have any of those kind of things where the conservation involves social groups, historic groups?
Yes, and no matter what the type of conservation that you work on, even with Frontera here, it's always in partnership with others and to make it a success. But I can't think of more. The historic side would come in when I was in Central Texas. In Michigan, it was more of Centennial Farms, and that's what was getting built on and bought up and removed, was the Centennial Farms there.
Okay, what about it?
And actually, as a corollary to the preservation of Keystone, it turns out that Wrestler Arroyo is actually the major feeder of water into that wetland area.
Oh, okay.
So that even though the dam, Keystone Dam, is there to protect people from down below, the water that comes down Thunder Canyon gets trapped behind the Keystone Dam and then percolates down and helps recharge the water that sustains Keystone Heritage Park. So it was a nice, fortuitous event that we were able to preserve Wrestler Arroyo and make that something that helps sustain in a partnership in a way with another organization here in El Paso, the Keystone Heritage Group.
Oh, good. Now let's take either end of valleys in El Paso. We're a big city with a big mountain right in the middle of it, and we go all around and everything. In some of your land trust preservations, what about what we call the Mission Valley area or Lower Valley? What's happening down there? Anything that you have there designated that you're trying to preserve?
Well, we don't have a particular project at this point that we're working on, but we are discussing, trying to work with groups like the Rio Bosque Wetlands Park to help get water rights obtained from landowners that no longer use the water for irrigation or something like that. And the idea is that if people are able to sell their water rights to somebody else, say to Frontera or to the Rio Bosque Wetlands Park, that will provide a source of water for that particular park down there. But we would also be interested in working with anyone who wants to help preserve arroyos, for example, or places where water can be allowed to go into recharge areas, because we see water resources as a very important part and function of open space. And so anything that can serve multiple functions, protecting wildlife as well as helping recharge.
Well, that'd be the same in the Upper Valley then.
Exactly.
You have the same concerns of what's happening in the Upper Valley.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of growth at Canutillo and Anthony. It's just going all over the place up there.
One of the things that Frontera has had as its goal is to preserve not only natural open space, but also working farms and working ranches, because there's a lot of pressure on both of those entities to sell their land for development. And so those lands are valuable not only for the materials that they produce, the farm goods or the cattle or that sort of thing, but they're also an important part of our heritage. El Paso was a huge place for agricultural production from its very beginnings up until the 30s, the 1930s. There were lots of truck farms and things in the lower valley. And many of those are disappearing because of the pressure for development at this point. So one of the things that Frontera is interested in doing is helping preserve some of these working farms and ranches to preserve not only those open spaces, but also to help preserve those ways of life.
We have about 4 minutes remaining. Janaé, I have a question for you on that part. Is how do you convince a young person in a family? The family's gotten old and the seniors don't want to work the farm anymore. They don't have the energy and time to work the farm. And you've got these kids, some of them fighting with each other who's going to get the land and what they can do with it. How do you deal with those issues?
We deal with the landowner when we talk about conservation easements, which is the agreement that restricts the type of development on the surface of the property, which allows the natural resources or the scenic view or the water, whatever natural element you're trying to protect in perpetuity. And so as we work with the actual landowner or their children and grandchildren, they get to hear the story of their grandparents or parents, and they see the value of it to them. But them as children may not see the value. They may see something where you can make money, you can sell it and subdivide. But with a conservation easement, it's a very flexible tool. It's there permanently. You can't remove it once it's on the property. But in the agreement, they can state if they have, say, for example, 100 acres, and the landowner doesn't want to develop any of it, but they can, if they wish to, set aside X number of acres for a future house. And maybe that child or grandchild wishes to have a hunting lodge, or they may have, along the river, they may be able to allow kayaking or a summer cottage or something. So there's a lot of flexibility to actually placing a conservation easement on your property. There are possible tax deductions through at the federal level. There's property taxes may be adjusted down to ranching and farming status. So there's other financial benefits. Another benefit that people forget about when you place conservation easements on a property is that if you're inheriting this property, you will get taxed. And so there's a way you can look at it and figure out your inheritance tax on it, and you can do it actually after the death of a parent if you're inheriting this property up to 12 months or 9 months to actually address that, place a conservation easement on it, and it may affect what you have to pay back to the government.
Great.
But there's
so much. We have about 2 minutes remaining. Last word?
I just wanted to mention one other thing related to this is that when you put a conservation easement on a piece of property, you're not giving up the property. You're only, in essence, giving up the development rights, but you still own it. So if it's a ranch, you may not be able to sell it to a developer to have homes put on it, but you can sell it again as a ranch. So it will transfer to anybody else who wants to be a rancher. You can sell it to them. So it's not a taking of any property.
Well, that's an important point. Gosh, our time has gone so fast, 28 minutes. And
really.
So we've learned a lot in that short amount of time, and we're thankful for you and people like you that seek to preserve the future. You're seeking to preserve a good future for us. Thank you very much for being here, Janaé and Scott. Thanks for watching us today on Perspectives El Paso. Tune in for another program in the future. I'm Leon Blevins.